joining us today to this last session of the year of the Social Movements and Political Action monthly seminar. We are very happy to have this today guest that will present this work and paper that I had the opportunity to read already some months ago, and that I really found very helpful for my work and my research, and I'm sure you will think the same after the presentation. And so about the thinking solidarity movements as infrastructure, insights from Athens. So thank you very much for joining us, Hara, Kouki, Dimitris, Pettas, and Athina Arampatzi. In a few minutes, I will give the floor to Tiago Carvalho, who is co-organizing the seminar with me, to introduce today's session and our today's speakers. I just spent very few words to introduce the seminar series. It has been existing for almost 10 years. The first session was in October 2014. This is our page. The seminars used to be face-to-face until the pandemic. Since the pandemic, we started moving online. Practically, we didn't lose a month of seminars, so we continued. We immediately moved online. And when the pandemic more or less finished, we started having hybrid or sessions, so we continued online. And this also means that the sessions are recorded, and that you can find all of them here, and also the video of the session. That you can watch and do whatever you want with it. You can see that we have been dealing with many different topics connected to social movements or related to social movements, also from different perspectives, disciplinary perspective, geographic areas, epistemology. So the idea of this seminar is really to bridge to bring together different view about forms of action, of political action that are not, they don't pass solutions, but what we consider as a political action is very broad. So we have space for very different types of topics and issues and scenarios and geographical areas in the world. So I hope to see you in the next sessions too. We have, in January, usually we don't have any seminar. We come back in February. Tiago, remind me, it is in 29th of February? No, I don't...
yes, the 29th of February.
Yeah, so we will have a book
I was just
launch.
looking at that this morning.
Yeah, we will have a book launch about social movements in Africa. A book coordinated by our colleague Dalina Sanchez from CIES-Iscte, with 3 discussants specialized on social movements, sub-Saharan Africa. But now it's time to stop here and to thanks again our guests of today, and to give the floor to Tiago to introduce them. Thank you. Sorry. I need to stop share. Perfect.
Okay, so I want to thank you. I thank Hara, Athina, and Dimitris for accepting our invitation to be here today to present their recently published paper on solidarity movements as infrastructures. And I'll briefly and quickly introduce them, and then give them the floor, as they are the stars of the day. And so. Sorry, Athina Arampatzi is a postdoc research fellow at the Department of Spatial Planning and Development at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. She has a PhD in social geography from the University of Leeds. And her work engages with social innovation, urban government, solidarity, and social movements by employing action research and participatory engagement with activist groups. Kouki is an assistant professor at the Sociology department at the University of Crete, and also teaches at the Hellenic Open University. She is trained as an historian and did her PhD at the Birkbeck College, University of London, and then she works at the European University Institute, Durham University, Newcastle, and she is also a member of the Center on Social Movement Studies. Finally, Dimitris Pettas is a senior researcher at the Department of Regional and Economic Development at the Panteion University. He has a PhD from the National Technical University of Athens, School of Architecture. He has worked in the various universities across Athens, and he's also a lecturer in the Social and Solidarity Economic Postgrad program at the Hellenic Open University. He works on social production of public space, development of platform economy, and its impacts on urban environment, among other topics. I'll finish here, and I'll give the floor to Athina, Hara, and Dimitris to present. Thank you again for being here with us today.
Thank you very much. So my name is Hara, and we are going to present parts of the paper, all the three of us. But as I am the first to start, let me thank Guya and Tiago on behalf also of Dimitris and Athina for inviting us here, for finding our paper interesting. That's very flattering. And also for running this seminar, which is very active and interesting. And actually, it is like an infrastructure of social movement research, and we know how much energy and time that it requires. So we are very thankful for that, and we wanted to thank you, especially for this. Okay, so we are going to briefly discuss with you the paper that was published like 1 year, I think 1 year ago in Social Movement Studies. We kind of reversed parts of the paper. So I will be presenting first how we started thinking about solidarity mobilizations that developed throughout the first period of the lockdown in Athens. Then Dimitris will follow to present some of our findings. And lastly, Athina will reflect more on our conceptual and analytical approach. So actually, we reversed our paper in order to end up with what we wanted to actually open up. We wanted to open up a discussion about our conceptual analytical approach, exactly in order to reflect upon whether and how we can use social reproduction and infrastructure as useful tools for social movement literature. So we wanted actually to discuss that with you. So that's why we're going to present the paper in this series. So let me share with you a brief PowerPoint that can help us. Okay. Can you, is that okay? Can you, okay, cool. So let me start from mapping a bit solidarity in Greece, and more specifically in Athens, the solidarity landscape. So solidarity actions are not new. Rather, they have regained momentum within social movement activities since 2010, when austerity measures started to be enforced in the country, provoking actually a humanitarian crisis that shattered the living standards of large parts of the population and decreased public infrastructure and key services, such as health, education, or welfare. Actually, the mere reproduction of life was destabilized in 2010 onwards. And actually, this provoked something that I guess you would have heard of. This provoked an immediate response by people who took massively to the streets to protest, giving form to an anti-austerity movement that was often conflictual and significantly massive. So following this eruptive wave of protest events, or actually in parallel with this eruptive wave of protest events, solidarity became central as a practice of everyday, ordinary politics of self-organization and commoning in neighborhoods. And we kind of experienced, as people living in Greece, and more specifically in Athens, we experienced what is called by now solidarity movements. Solidarity movements developed throughout those years across neighborhoods, across cities, engaging thousands of people so as to address unmet social needs in healthcare, education, food, and other basic goods, enabling our cities, and I think mostly Athens, not to collapse, enabling our cities to survive throughout the crisis. So such solidarity initiatives were remobilized in light of the refugee crisis of 2015, this time also in rural areas and islands, in support of all those refugee and migrant populations that were looking for shelter. So reflecting on this very rich mobilization that developed throughout the last decade or so, we kind of view it as an infrastructure that addressed a severe crisis of social reproduction. And that happened even in periods when collective action was seemingly absent or invisible in terms of public sphere. So that brings us to our second point, which is how did we, as researchers, understand this kind of eruption of solidarity within our movement milieu, within movement activity. It seems that to begin with, this solidarity mobilization kind of posed a challenge for social movement studies. And it was not easily accommodating with already existing understanding of social movements. And that was the case exactly because solidarity mobilization is characterized by a fluid, temporal, and kind of fragile character. And within that, there are hardly any claim-making actions or protest events. So solidarity movements are often seen as a less visible form of collective action that takes place between cycles of contention. And solidarity movements are often causally interpreted as a withdrawal or even a cooptation of movement energies by power holders, or also as kind of a reflection of the depoliticization of societies. But this kind of solidarity mobilizations also became the object of research in what concerns, for example, urban urban geography or anthropology. And researchers started to study solidarity mobilizations also in these terms. And for these reasons, we had people started to realize the analytic merit of solidarity and to understand solidarity as an analytical category so as to conceptualize this new form of political struggle against austerity. So we had also a shift towards a concept as the commons, so solidarity economy, and so on and so forth. So all these studies many studies are very helpful for us to understand the emancipatory features of what is happening around us the last 10 years. But still, we have this, the three of us, we share this feeling, this understanding that this body of research understands collective action as a whole that is consisted of two separate forms of action that are also studied separately, so protest and solidarity. And they tend to treat solidarity as a less important and like subordinate form of action, or on the other hand, to kind of emphasize the conflictual character of solidarity and its adversarial character, as if they want to elevate it to the level of protest. So this conceptual and analytical dichotomy, we think that leaves significantly underexplored what we find very interesting, the socially reproductive role of solidarity movements. And this social reproductive role that is very actually evident in crisis-ridden contexts as the one that we experienced the last 10 years in Athens. So we kind of share this understanding of literature review and how solidarity is treated especially within social movement studies. And then what happened in Greece is that the pandemic crisis, that we're not going now to map exactly what happened. Actually, it's kind of similar throughout Europe and I guess Portugal also, as we are here today. We just wanted to highlight the fact that in Greece and specifically in Athens, we experienced the most severe, the most strict countrywide lockdown in Europe due to the very strict, severe mobility restrictions. So especially from March 23, 2020, the Greek government imposed a restriction of all non-essential movement, except for very specific narrow reasons. So we couldn't leave our home without an ID or a signed attestation of the purpose of travel. Otherwise, we would be checked or even arrested by police forces circulating around the cities, especially in Athens. So that was a very strict lockdown. And at the same time, it was propagated, it was presented as yet another success story by the government as slowing down the spread of the disease. Individual responsibility was the way that the government and mainstream media tried to frame this period for Greek citizens, actually referring to the fact that each citizen individually was responsible for all the negative consequences related with COVID-19. So once again, immediately upon the imposition of this countrywide lockdown, we experienced the fact that people devised immediately ways to support those vulnerable. And that happened through the development of local, decentralized and online grassroots solidarity initiatives. And this was a parallel movement that happened especially, exactly like 10 years ago, with people giving form to a grassroots, rather invisible solidarity movement, challenging the official understanding of the pandemic crisis. And that brings us to how we thought of starting this paper. So the three of us, we are citizens. We live in the city of Athens, and we are engaged during the last decade in neighborhood collectives, in collectivities in the city of Athens. And at the same time, we are the three of us researchers, trying to understand and to make sense of austerity, its impact on our cities, and the resistance against austerity by our fellow citizens. So we kind of shared this concern that was there throughout the last few years, but became much more evident during the pandemic. So this question refers to the one that you can also see in the slide. How can we actually conceptualize movement activity when actually we could not move? No? How we can understand movement activity when withdrawal was actually something enforced? How can we account at the very same time for this decade-long role of solidarity in the city that actually could no longer be understood just as a response to the crisis, because solidarity had become, during all this time, a permanent feature of our daily lives and actually had become an organic activity of all movement initiatives around us. So we couldn't make sense of what was happening, and we decided to start a very brief problematization, a reflection about solidarity mobilization during the first lockdown in Athens, so as to make sense better of what was happening. And we decided to read solidarity movements as an infrastructure, actually, that challenged enforced realities and provided the social reproductive means during this pandemic crisis so as to enable people to survive collectively. So now Dimitris is going to...
Yes, hello. I would like to thank you for the invitation. So I'm going to present very briefly the main findings of our research, which mostly focused on tracing continuities, new things that entered the repertoire and the actions of solidarity movements in Athens, and how we came to the point to decide to go with this infrastructure building approach concerning the solidarity movements during the pandemic. So what we did, we focused on the period from May to July 2020. As Hara said before, all three of us were mobilized in local initiatives in the district we're all living back then. So we had this active engagement in solidarity and mutual aid actions organized in Athens. We also decided to launch for 3 months an online qualitative survey, mostly to explore these continuities, because initially we were very surprised of how fast these solidarity movements adapted and responded to the new needs that were emerging during the pandemic period. So we want to have more info, more insights from other people that were also active in these movements, or they were mobilized for the first time during the pandemic. We also moved on with an ethnographic observation of online and in vivo public events that took place in the same period. And we also went through some secondary material analysis, such as new social media accounts, especially digital means, digital infrastructure that were developed during the pandemic. So what is very important in our research, and which led us to this infrastructure thinking, is the continuities. We saw a very important sense of continuity from the crisis period to the pandemic crisis period. So from our respondents, the vast majority was involved previously in solidarity actions during the economic crisis period and before the pandemic. And they were people that were very active in these initiatives and this movement. So 77% of them they had regular and frequent involvement. Also, it's important the initiatives through which these people, the more collective initiatives through which these people were mobilized. So again, the majority of these initiatives were active also before the pandemic period. Networks and collectives that were present, they were active in Athens before the pandemic. Also, the people themselves, they anticipated their involvement as a continuation of their political, social activity that emerged over the last decade and before the pandemic again. So we also tried to ask them to see what mobilized them during the crisis period, those who were involved in both, and what changed during the pandemic period. So it was important that the feelings of anger and their mobilization, mostly through ideological positioning, retreated. So what came in front was the need of people to take care of the more vulnerable parts of population, and also to themselves to confront the fear that the pandemic condition imposed to all of us. Also, this narrative, this mainstream narrative that was circulated through the conservative government and most of the media, what Hara discussed earlier, that the individual responsibility concerning the crisis was very much reversed. So people actually stayed at home in order to protect themselves and the most vulnerable part of the population, such as the eldest. And also they were very afraid, and this is now in the paper, we have some statistics that back this argument up, that the national healthcare system wouldn't be able to hold a very rapid and severe expansion in terms of incidence. So what were the priorities during this period? There was increased need for affect, relationality, and mutual support. There was a focus, a very specific focus, because new, let's say, vulnerable groups emerged during the pandemic crisis that didn't directly, there was big overlaps, of course, that they didn't directly correspond to the ones during the crisis period, where the criteria was mostly economic. So here we also have elder people who had to commute to their work, that they had to work with other people working in the national healthcare system. So the focus also expanded to adapt to the specificities of the pandemic period. So it was also because of the pandemic conditions that people couldn't move, but also most of them didn't want to endanger other people. So protests and confrontational collective actions that were very, very upfront during the crisis period retreated. What was also very important is that some initiatives, some networks, some collectives that they didn't include solidarity actions in their repertoire prior to the pandemic, they shifted their priorities, they expand their repertoire, so they tried to reach out to these vulnerable populations through solidarity actions, solidarity and care. We also had a rise compared to the economic crisis period of more individual initiated action. So people, along with their families, with their friends, they were buying food, they would cook, and they will go at night on the streets and give food to homeless people. This without any, let's say, more official or collective group mediating in these actions. Also, the online infrastructure, the digital infrastructure was very important. Also concerning information sharing. So, for example, labor rights during the pandemic period. Communication networking had to be moved online to facilitate the needs of the specific conditions. Or issues that emerged and intensified during the pandemic, such as domestic violence and precarious work. So there were, for example, initiatives concerning sex workers during the pandemic. And it was in this frame that we also saw new repertoires, new actions emerging, such as placing protest banners in balconies, posting flyers in buildings in order to help the elderly neighbors to get access to the essentials, so people offering to help, offering to go shopping. We had these kinds of activity. So two major conclusions that were drawn from these shifts, but also continuities in this repertoire of the solidarity and social movements, is what Hara discussed earlier, that the boundaries between confrontation and solidarity practices became blurred. Because some initiatives shifted their focus, and there were initiatives that used to put on claims or be prioritizing protest. But also there was an overlap of people. So people, this is what led us to this infrastructure thinking. That's not some people that protest, some people who participate in solidarity networks. There are stable, there are very well embedded networks in the city that can do both, and they can shift their actions according to the current conditions. And also there was a very strong challenging of perceived dichotomies between activists and beneficiaries of support, because at some point where a majority of people were having problems during the pandemic, they were shared, and also people that could be classified as beneficiaries had a very active engagement in the formation and the everyday running and operation of the solidarity networks. So our involvement was mostly through a neighborhood assembly, a residents association in the city center of Athens that has a very long history in the neighborhood, was established in 2008. Let's say that it used to be kind of an urban movement, so it was focusing on local urban issues in the neighborhood. But during the crisis, the economic crisis, and during the pandemic, also incorporated numerous solidarity actions. So the main things was the collection, distribution of food and basic goods to families that were in the neighborhood imprisoned women and refugees. So this is because the initiative, the assembly itself, has very strong, has an access to networks in the family, so local knowledge, but also it opened up digitally, both in order to communicate their actions, but also to get in touch with possible beneficiaries. Also, the assembly itself was affected by the condition of the pandemic, so it mostly shifted its operation online in order to meet, run the assembly, etc. The second initiative concerns an open source digital platform that was formed specifically, explicitly for to answer to some of the issues raised by the pandemic in March 22. So its main role was the information, it operates as an information, communication, and coordination hub. So it operates as a medium, an online medium for giving and receiving care of bridging people, but also sharing information. So it concerned protest, professionals, volunteers were able to offer free psychological support services, collectives that were preoccupied with the creation of digital resources and how they can be shared openly. They coordinate the 3D printing makerspace and providing support for labor rights during there was very substantial challenge during the pandemic. So drawing from that, we had these feelings of fear along with anger, but also impossible to express in the form of protest that was the usual mean during the economic crisis, and was this embracement of vulnerability in both embodied and digitized form. What was very important in this continuity that we also experienced ourselves, but we also witnessed in several other initiatives, because also many of the new initiatives, the new networks of the online networks and digital platforms that occurred during the pandemic were initiated by people that previously had the active engagement in the social movements and solidarity movements. So this response in the form of solidarity, it was very clearly built upon previous capacity experience of social movements, but yet it was very, up to a degree, quite successfully adapted to the new conditions and the new needs that were imposed by the pandemic period.
Thank you also on my behalf for the invitation. What I will try to do now, and thank you Dimitris and Hara for setting the grounds for the discussion. I will try to give an outline and flesh out the main ideas, the main concepts that we used, so as to give you an outline of how we constructed our conceptual framework, and hopefully through the discussion we can actually take this forward and maybe deconstruct it. So how the question was how to rethink solidarity movements as through the lens of social reproduction infrastructures. As Hara set it out before, these two questions were sort of the main guiding questions throughout the research and throughout writing this article. How can we, on the one hand, reconceptualize movement activity when movement was banned? And at the same time, how can we think of this enduring role of solidarity in broader social movements? So in order to try and examine these, we turn to social reproduction theory, and of course, especially addressed through feminist thinking. Silvia Federici's work is seminal in this regard. So in this instance, social reproduction is discussed as activities, practices, relations through which our lives and labor are daily constituted and reconstituted. And taking these in the context of the post-economic crisis period, again, many many European countries went through this, and Portugal was one as well. So how can we rethink politics as reproductive politics in context where austerity, precarity, and dispossession prevailed, and especially linked to a crisis of care as set out by the Care Manifesto Collective in their book, when we were faced with a series of crises that involved social reproduction. Think of public services, public infrastructure, and so on and so forth. And then linking this discussion with what Ash Amin called the infrastructural turn in social sciences, we sort of turned to these discussions in order to change our view of infrastructure, not only as physical or material means or on terms, but as a relational concept that brings forward a series of materials, of people, of ideas, of processes, of technologies, of practices that actually make up our worlds. And in this sense, social reproduction infrastructures encompasses a broad spectrum of social material resources, as well as politics, labor, relations, affects, and spaces that enable human life itself, the reproduction of human life itself. These put into context of contemporary movements to us was very interesting because there are a series of more recent studies that place social reproduction very centrally within social movement activity, especially within the debates and the studies of social movements that problematize social spatial inequalities, the unequal access to the infrastructures of social reproduction, again, going back to what we knew as public services, as hospitals, as schools, universities, streets, etc., etc. And then finally, what we tried to do in the article, taking these concepts together, first, we suggested that we cannot think solidarity as a secondary auxiliary concept, but in practical and ontological terms as constitutive of social movements, as politically generative of subjects of political identity, and as socially reproductive itself through the practices that that Dimitris examined during the pandemic. The second point we made is that social movements cannot be seen, this is what we also suggest, as separated from what sustains them, from what sustains their social basis and fabric. And this, of course, also includes not only the visible, but also the less visible, the informal, the small acts, the invisible spaces, and the everyday practices. And then finally, solidarity movements, seen as inclusive and more broadly expanding our view of collective action to include the care practices. And in doing so, we suggested that this would mean a conceptual unsettling of binaries set within studies that place protest versus solidarity, place the activist versus the non-activist, or the donor versus the recipient of solidarity, the digital versus the embodied, etc. So during the pandemic, we suggested that these binaries were sort of unsettled. And finally, to conclude and hopefully open up to an interesting discussion, why infrastructure and why social reproduction? I already said how we sort of try to bring in these ideas and sort of flesh out from the empirical field. The paper also suggested that social reproduction, solidarity, and care could also be seen as co-constitutive in how they enable new relations, as in the period of the lockdown in Athens, especially in contexts where we see crises persisting, taking different forms, different dimensions. And in the case of the pandemic, where, as Hara put it before, societies were seen to be demobilized. So in trying to put these concepts together, we also thought about how all these bring forward the relationalities, a politics of relational dispossession, of how this period brought forward this kind of idea of how we were all dispossessed in a relational sense, the materialities, thinking beyond the crisis and towards the everyday, beyond the protest, exceptional moments, and towards the everyday practices, but also looking into how social movement activity might continue, but also change and transform over time to adapt to new conditions, to new social needs. And of course, what was also interesting, and I think this is has been discussed a lot lately within social movement literature, is how a feminist view can bring in different perspectives. So just to conclude with these two questions, if we have established that we can see and examine social movements through the view of social reproduction infrastructure, then maybe we could ask what actually constitutes, what makes these infrastructures work, what makes parts, what are their parts, and how they are articulated. How can we actually research that? And this is where was this idea that we had about assemblage theory and assemblage thinking as methodology of trying to sort of locate and see these articulations and disarticulations within the infrastructures of social reproduction. And just a question that popped up among us three when we were discussing today's presentation, it would be very interesting, and hopefully this will open up the discussion, to ask you of if these concepts are useful and if you could employ them to rethink the pandemic experience in other contexts, such as Portugal or Brazil or Italy, since we have colleagues from different spaces. So that's it from us. Thank you very much. And let's go into the questions discussion.
Okay, so I'm stop sharing.
Yeah, so thank you so much. That's great. We have a lot of food for thinking. So so if someone want to jump into this question and give some feedback, some reflection, we open the floor. You want to?
Can I?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Really was really interesting, and yes, I think I'm gonna read the paper. I still didn't read. Yes, as well, of course, I'm doing a PhD on housing social movements in Lisbon, but I'm also an activist, and I've been an activist for many years now in Lisbon. And I found lots of similarities, even if the context, especially talking about struggles, are different now. I know a little bit about Athens also, and there is much more structured and already settled infrastructures, the materials one, I mean, of movements than in Lisbon. At the same time, I found that at the beginning of the at the beginning of the pandemic, you say people, social movements were ready, and as an activist here, what surprised me most was the way we were ready to arise claims and at the same time to bring solidarities. And I mean, housing social movements, but also the social spaces that already existed, that they weren't that protagonists, as let's say, in the month before, but in the very first period of the pandemic, from March, the same period you studied actually, I think we were very ready in the same way. So I think that it is useful to the frame you use, because I think that solidarity became, starting from there, I think that solidarity became something much more common in our discourse and in our also yes, of course, discourse, but also methodology, and also in our self education somehow. So we start reading that much more, and we arrived, for example, in 2023, in which the biggest banner we show during the biggest housing demonstration since years in Portugal was solidarity above property. And so I think that solidarity is it is a key, a solidarity infrastructure. It is a key for reading these kind of movements. And I have many things to say actually, but I think that also it is very interesting thinking about this new social movement, contemporary social movement, as social reproduction, because I think we are going in this direction. I have a question, because actually even it's not your study, but I was in Lisbon, at least the very first lockdown, and from March 2020 to the summer was very active. Many canteens and solidarity networks arise, but the long COVID, let's say, awakened a lot these kinds of experience, and it lasts a little bit. It took a little bit to retake until last year, let's say. Of course, the contexts are different, and so I don't know if in Athens it happens the same. And I will stop here, otherwise I will talk too much. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you, Antonio. So now we have Bruno that you also would like to ask a question. Bruno is a visiting scholar from Brazil here in Lisbon now. He's also working on housing. I will unmute you. You're mute. You need to, Bruno?
Okay.
Sure.
Okay. Good afternoon, Guya, and good afternoon, all. I have two questions to present. I participate to movement, no housing movements in Brazil, and during the pandemic period, we organized solidarity kitchens. It's a kind of communitary kitchen promoted by the movement, and now this initiative has been incorporated like a public policy in Brazil after the start of the Lula's government. Okay, and there are some initiatives this way in Greece. Okay, the state of Greece has incorporated this initiative like a public policy. This the first question, and the second question is, in your opinion, where is the border between these new forms of solidarity inside the movement, and the movement assumes public responsibilities. Okay, for example, this issue in Brazil, it's very polemic because we passed by many neoliberal reforms, and in this way, the state don't promote us public services. So when the movement promote these public services or communitary services, it's a little complex, okay? And where is the border in where's the border between that new forms of solidarity and to reforçar, to became strong the neoliberal discourse, okay? That's the two questions.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, my bad English. Okay.
No, that's fine. So maybe we collect one more. Actually, I have something a little bit connected to what Bruno was saying. So maybe if Tiago, if you allow me, as co-organizer of the seminar. Thank you. So yeah, so you know that I really like the paper, and it's very inspiring for me, and all these concepts are very helpful for my work. Also because of the things that Antonio was underlined that about the Lisbon field. I particularly also like this overlapping between the different actors, beneficiaries and activists, which is always difficult to define who is who and who is what is doing, etc. So this is a very important. I think it's very important to have a paper published in Social Movement Studies defining these things, because we can all use them and defend our positions thanks to it. And this is very important because it's a kind of statement, I think, also theoretically. In respect to my the connection with what Bruno was saying, so there are two things, and I understand what one thing is that when for instance, I teach these things, particularly with students, the first question is, social movements they are doing voluntary work. So what is the distinction? How we can distinguish social movements and voluntary work? I know that there is, for sure, it's clear for me because there is a contentious stance, contentious framing of these actions. So there is also a communication part of this in a certain way. The way these actions and the solidarity is framed is not just solidarity; it's also framed in a contentious way, which is because if not, it's volunteer work. So I think that this can be a point that is can be a little bit underlined, and this brings me a little bit to a debate that was in Italy many years ago among people working more in social movements, but from the more civil society organizations perspective, and they were arising this issue that Bruno was also mentioning, in a kind of neoliberal landscape with the state that doesn't assume the responsibility of social care and of many things. And there is a big debate also in movements traditionally. So we need to intervene and to fill this gap of the absence of the state. We need to denounce the state, because if we continue to intervene, so it's kind of states delegate to other groups responsibilities that should be on the side of the state. And so in a certain way, there is also a big discourse about big society, no? That was a little bit like this, the big society that is better to a society doing certain things than the state in a kind of neoliberal perspective. And to what, yeah, and so if I well understood also the perspective, what Bruno was asking, so maybe this is also kind of, I don't know if we can have a reflection about that, or, and I think that this thing of, that these actions are all, they also themselves have a critical message and a very strong contentious message against the governments in force, brings a solution for this. But I stop here. So maybe we can stop here with this round of questions and maybe introduce something else after. If you want to.
Can I try to respond partially at least? So especially concerning Guya's and Bruno's questions, there is always, I mean, this discussion always comes up in terms of, I'm thinking about it in terms of my own experience and what are the limits of participation. And just to express something experiential, sometimes we also feel fed up with volunteering our work and our time and our care and solidarity. You feel that in the end there is no, let's say, imprint on the broader political sphere. I will try to respond mainly with something I mentioned before, and thinking about David Featherstone's book, 2012, I think it was. It was called Solidarity, and he was taking on from Gramsci. He was trying to, and he was putting forward this argument that solidarity itself, and based on his research on the labor movement in the UK, solidarity itself can be politically generative. It can generate political subjects. So he was locating this relationship between solidarity and contestation, how by this goes to the context of Greece, and I suppose it could be the same for Portugal or Italy or places that we lived this upsurge of social movements with the economic crisis, or Spain, that solidarity movements were politicizing the crisis. They were putting forward a discourse and a practice that was saying, okay, we are collecting food. We are, we also have collective kitchens here as well, to respond to Bruno. And I have been following one as well. We are trying to bring together people to cook, to collect foods, to feed people, etc., etc. But at the same time, we are putting forward a discourse and practice that politicizes the lack of food or the lack of... We are setting up social clinics and social pharmacies, but at the same time, we are claiming public health. So this was this double, how you say, double discourse, double practice, double movement between prefiguration of, we try to experiment in the here and now, but at the same time, trying to link this with the broader political context. I don't know if I responded well to your question. So going back to David Featherstone's work, he's saying that solidarity can actually produce political subjects. It's solidarity as practice, voluntary, etc. It is a practice of a political subjectification in that sense.
May I add something to what Athina said? I think this also reflects upon the discussions on urban commons, for example, that incorporate social reproduction activities, and whether it's just convenient for the state to have them because it doesn't have to do the work itself. I think what Athina said is very important, that by bringing people together, communicating your political, your prefigurative message and claims. And this is also why the infrastructural approach helps, because as we mentioned before, the same people who organize the solidarity actions are those who also organize protests. And this was happened. So by engaging in the one aspect of the activity, you also come in touch with the other aspect of the activity. So it has this prefigurative character. But also, especially during the crisis also, but especially during the pandemic, I think it was essential, the role of these solidarity networks, because they cared about people that were, for the state, invisible. So refugees with no proper paperwork and registration, sex workers that are not recognized as workers, all these people that are completely invisible for the state because there were some supporting measures, let's say, in different forms, but these people were never taken into account. So I think these two things were important. And concerning Antonio, if I understand well, you asked if this continued. Until now, right?
I think so.
It didn't. I mean, we don't, during the last years, we don't have any similar mobility. I don't know, Hara and Athina can complement that.
Can I also add something to what Athina, to what Athina and Dimitris said? I think, first of all, thank you for the questions that are very, I mean, they were actually very interesting and also difficult to respond in the sense of having a very clear, definite answer, but we just reflect on these questions are pending. I think there are questions that are pending. So in what concerns this dilemma, you know, are we helping, are we resisting something, or are we just, you know, enabling it not to collapse? So, which is like a permanent question in what concerns this kind of solidarity activities. I mean, I agree, building on what Athina and Dimitris said, I just wanted to make clear that maybe we didn't make it clear throughout the presentation that actually in practice, in everyday reality in Athens, it was not at all difficult. I mean, it was very easy to understand what was social movement existing solidarity and what was co-opted by the state. I mean, you could feel it and you could see it. So maybe when we transfer it into a power presentation, academic one, we lose this thing. But in practice, I don't think this is a burning question. I don't know if Athina and Dimitris agree, in the sense that you can easily understand, you know, the energies of the people, the anti-authoritarian, the critique, you know, that helping people means criticizing why these people have been left alone, are vulnerable, nobody cares about these people. This is something that is, it's recurring, it's there. It's not something you have to explain. So I think this solidarity action departs from this critique. It's not something that needs to be explicitly, I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to say. And I think that this ends up during the last few years being more an academic question, exactly because now in Greece, I don't know about Portugal or Italy, even the mere act of solidarity is being criminalized. Being solidarian to refugees now means being arrested, you know, or during the lockdown, running collective kitchens in Athens meant being arrested or being forcefully detained or being checked and having to pay fines. So being it's not like big society was some decades ago. I mean, being solidarian at the moment is actually a risky business, no? It's kind of a resisting praxis, I think, during the last few years. So I think in practice it's actually quite clear what Dimitris and Athina said, that actually being in solidarity with those left out actually is politicizing social reproduction. And that is why politicizing social reproduction solidarity meant that many more people were engaged in social movement activity that could not be engaged beforehand. So yeah, that was the one thing I wanted to say. The other thing I want to say concerning Guya's question about this distinction between the beneficiary and the solidarian, the activist and the vulnerable, you know, that is being blurred. I think that's what you mentioned, you know, that this distinction. I think actually that was already happening during the crisis, because many people who were involved in collective kitchens, for example, cooking of selective food, were people who were actually in need in the first place. So in these solidarian spaces, you could not easily differentiate between who was the volunteer and who was the one in need. So you had this blurring already. And during the pandemic, that was totally the case, exactly because I think social reproduction and care became priorities. And I think also conceptually care, the way we see care and the readings we have concerning care, depart from this understanding that we are all interdependent and we are all vulnerable at some point of our lives. So this shared vulnerability is part of the solidarity movement and departs from the fact that there are no distinctions between, we are all in need and we are all vulnerable, so you cannot easily put an hierarchy between different roles. So I think this is very interesting what you mentioned, because also the concept of care helps us towards this point. And then, if I understood what Tiago, what Antonio mentioned, I think also Athina and Dimitris, I mean, the three of us shared this, when we were thinking how to present this paper, we shared this concern that things did not continue like this in the following months of lockdown. And actually, I guess that's something that prevails around Europe, that crisis is ongoing, is getting harder and harder, and solidarity activities, movement activities are receding, are not visible, are not live. So what's going on? And I think, I mean, we are, I don't know if disappointed is the right word to describe our feelings, but I think, at least in what concerns what we presented, that the thinking through infrastructure actually helps us understand that social movements, it's not about something exceptional, not just something about exceptional events, loud activities, visible protests and gatherings and things that can change, abruptly and very visibly and tangibly what's happening around us. But all this infrastructure that has been built for the last 10, 15 years, the social reproduction, that it's the everyday life of movements, is something more stable than we tend to think, and can make us, I think, and it's also can be quite unpredictable and irrational when it's going to erupt and when it's going to turn into something different. So thinking through infrastructure maybe enables to see through time, and not to expect these spectacular moments, just to study these spectacular moments. Yeah. I don't know if I made myself clear. Maybe this is wishful thinking. Yeah.
It's very interesting. I think that Karenina also would like to add something. Yeah.
Thank you. I found this very interesting. And of course, social movements is, to be honest, not my field of expertise, but I am very interested in social movements and protest movements and resistance movements. And I've done some small research before, and but not so much in the European context. Like, for example, in the context of Lebanon, where there is degrees of state failure and there is a need for alternative infrastructures, and then there are civil societies combined with solidarity movements combined with social movements that, in a sense, co-produce what is needed for society. So in some respects, in the case as it has been described in Greece, I understand that there is a breakdown of what should have been provided by the state in the sense of basic necessities, healthcare, etc. And then I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the difference between something like this and the online and protest movements that are happening now in, for example, regarding Palestine and the ongoing bombing, because you see a lot of you see both people coming into the streets and protesting, and then you also see the ongoing mobilization on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook actions. They have managed to boycott. There's ongoing boycotts, not just of Israel, but specific companies. For example, in Morocco, Starbucks had to close down because everybody had boycotted it, and I think also H&M. But in the sense of Greece, or the case that I'm familiar with, Lebanon, where there is a kind of breakdown of state services provided, then I see the social movements definitely as infrastructure and as a replacement for the lacking infrastructure in one sense. But in the other case, you could also say that there's a breakdown because the UN is not able to overcome the US's veto. So there's a breakdown in the function of the UN. But it's perhaps not on the same level, if you will. So I'm wondering if you have any comments about that. Or maybe that was just confusing. Was the question clear?
If I can try to resume, is a little bit like the idea of social movements also as communicational infrastructure in a certain way in the digital sphere. Maybe before can you Tiago?
Can I?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so thank you, Guya, and thank you for the great presentation and paper. I really enjoyed reading it. A lot of the questions that I had have been asked already. They were mainly about political implications of the solidarity movements and their relation with institutions, and even if they had become something else and growing into, the typical case of institutionalization and becoming a party. I know that's not the case, but it could be one of the things. One of the things that I thought it was interesting, but it was not exactly clear to me, is that, well, now that I think about it, it's interesting if you think on a Polanyian perspective. They're not actually retreating from society. They're keeping society up when the market invades everything, and the state retreats as well. But my main question was, I was thinking of Jeffrey Alexander has this book called The Civil Sphere, and this comes from a more cultural sociology background. And he defines solidarity as the building of witness, and being a cultural sociologist, he is mainly thinking about imaginaries and narratives and symbols that emerge from a particular movement to create this idea of togetherness, right? And so thinking about that as well, there was Alex Kentekilinis published a paper a few years ago about a similar topic in Greece, in Athens, where there was one of the things that he said was that in those solidarity groups and that emerged as an alternative to the lack of state intervention in social clinics and food banks and so on, there was also a particular symbology and imaginary narrative coming up. So I was wondering if that was the case for the groups that you studied as well. And that's it. Thank you.
One last question? No? Okay, so we can, if you have some comments on these two interventions.
Can I start, maybe? I don't know, I was thinking of Antonio's question and something popped up, although that sorry to go back, but I will take it from there and build on it. We often think that, and also linking that with Hara's comments before, we often think that all what we discuss now has evaporated into air, and we don't see this kind of activity going on anymore. But at the same time, I was thinking that as now we are facing let's say the first waves of the climate crisis. In Greece in September, we had very vast destructions from floods. The same groups, at least the ones I know in the city center, were the ones that started organizing, collecting goods, taking them to the people that were affected by the flood. So again, that might be another instance that these networks are mobilized. And going to Tiago's comment, this is what I sort of hinted before, that indeed, at least to my knowledge and experience, there is a certain sense of imaginary produced around solidarity while you are taking part in these actions, in these practices. I was recently in a discussion with colleagues, and they were giving me the etymology of the word solidarity, the Latin root, and it means to build on something solid, if I remember correctly. The Greek word, which is allelegi, is to be sort of close to each other, if I translate it correctly. Maybe Hara and Dimitris can help out with this. So there is a certain imaginary attached to that as well. There is a certain imaginary, which of course can be problematic, and I can explain what I mean, of equality. So we start being solidarian to each other, so we set off, or sort of in a performative way, we are performing in equality as we are being solidarian. It can be problematic because it might hide inequalities, but we can be critical about that at the same time. But it's sort of a starting point of building common identities, I think. And this is what I was hinting before with Featherstone's book on, he was studying the labor movement, but we can take this discussion maybe to different sorts of movements. And this kind of being close to each other, what does that mean? Close in terms of sameness or even indifference? Another argument that can be made, that solidarity is also a practice that builds on difference, for instance. Again, many examples of studies of social movements can bring that forward. I will stop here because I spoke a lot.
Can we ask Nina, maybe to summarize the question, if we understood well, you asked whether the digital or mobilization through digital means can be thought of as infrastructure or something like that. Was maybe could be like phrased like that, your question?
Well, what I'm saying is I definitely see the point of thinking of social movements as infrastructure, but I'm wondering if this applies to all cases, because in the case of Greece and the case of Lebanon, I see it definitely as an infrastructure, or specifically an alternate infrastructure to the expected, which should be the government providing these services. But when we look at other movements, as in, like the one regarding Palestine, or even the Iranian Women Life Freedom movement online, I wonder if those can be categorized as infrastructure.
Okay, so I'm going to think loudly. So Athina, Dimitris, if there's something you want to add or challenge, I mean, feel free. When you also before when you asked this question, and now that you rephrased it, and thank you for that. I was thinking that we start from the understanding that when infrastructures fail, then in some cases, like in Greece, infrastructures failed citizens. So we had, for this reason, these movements erupting that were different than before. So it's like as a response to a lack of something, you have the eruption of something else. And actually that's how we experienced it. And we started also already since 2010, we started, from different perspectives, it's the three of us, to start to reflect as academics and researchers and also citizens of what that means. So we started thinking, maybe, compared with France or Germany or compared with the past, now in Greece, because of the total collapse of everything, we have something new. But thinking through that, and now through this paper, I think, we realized that our thinking about social movements had ignored the socially productive aspects of social movements that are always there. We tend, as social movement scholars, we tend to put emphasis on the more organizational aspects or the more exceptional moments of protest events and this kind of stuff. So we tend to ignore somehow socially reproductive daily workings that are necessary for every social movement. So I think this line of thinking that I explained before made us realize that we're not talking just about, like a very specific moment of movement action in a failing state like the Greek one, sorry for that. But this is more or less a problematization about social movement research in general, that there are social reproductive practices, as like in a household, you have social reproductive practices every day that tend to be invisibilized, also racialized, and so on and so forth. But we tend to ignore these because they tend to be more invisible and less eventful. So if we transfer that and translate that into the social movement activity, I think the reflection we try to share with you is that every movement has this kind of socially productive aspect, and as a result, this infrastructural aspect. At least that's how I see it now. So so there is always a continuity, and there are always everyday invisible practices, spaces, and people or gatherings of people that work for a social movement to erupt and see it. So I think, I don't know if Dimitri and Athina, you agree with that. So I think this was the problematization, that there are infrastructural aspects in all social movements. And this can also be applied to the digital sphere. In which sense? I mean, what we realize that it's not easy anymore to separate between the digital and the physical. Yeah. Our everyday interaction is very blurred when it stops being digital and becomes physical, and that was also the case during the pandemic. So I think if we also apply this infrastructural thinking methodologically, but also analytically, we may kind of maybe things are revealed that we could not see before. That's how I think about it. Sorry if I I don't know, Athina, Dimitris, do you agree?
No, I fully agree. I was trying to think about the Palestinians issue. I think there are some differences because the solidarity there is mostly expressive, symbolic, narrational. So it didn't have the materiality that also occurred concerning local populations. And also there was also, it was happening on a different level because during the pandemic here, political parties organized very specific political organizations of the left, etc. They focused on creating a counter narrative. And this is also what happened with the the attack on Gaza, because this very well embedded in the Greek movement, the support to Palestinian people. So it was mostly also the events, the protest events were very much supported by these big, let's say, parliamentary parties, for example, the Communist Party or organizations of the left. But it's very well embedded for many decades. So there are also this, again, can say the most stable, a very stable network that also involves Palestinian organizations, the BSD movement. So also we had very quick responses, but it wasn't something as new as the pandemic, something so, I don't know, yes, like an emergency.
Can I just ask a question to further clarify?
No? If there is, maybe if there is someone else that is still haven't asked any question yet, want to intervene. If not, sure. It seems that.
I was interested in that part that Hara said about the things that we take for granted. And then when I think about the online Palestinian movement, I see that something that is new in there is the kind of parasocial relationships that people online have formed with journalists in Gaza who are posting every day. So then you have this kind of care expressed as well, like social support or emotional support also for them. Oh, we're checking to see if you're still alive and please don't. So it's not just a communication of, so in that sense, I see how this concept of infrastructures could be, in a sense, translated to other contexts that aren't necessarily about state failure or states not taking care of the infrastructure. Thank you. It's very interesting.
Yeah, this is a good point, actually. That also communication needs infrastructure. And this can be done by movements also. And I don't know if there are more questions. I think, I would like to do many more questions, but we will have the opportunity to meet, I hope, soon and to discuss face-to-face and after also enjoy some beers. This will be very nice, but this is in virtual context is not possible, at least together. So maybe we can finish here, or say if you have some last comments, some last short questions, or no. So okay, Hara,
we just wanted to thank you very much for inviting us, because also you made us reread the paper and understand, realize better what our point was and clarified. I mean, the questions were very insightful and helpful in the discussions, and we really enjoyed it. It's not like we actually honestly did. So thanks.
You're talking also for them. Maybe they didn't.
I agree.
And also what Jeremina said now about this thing that there is more space now for sharing, affect and care. Yeah. It's also that, I mean, it's also a very nice point, and I think it helps.
It's very nice, this point, actually. Maybe Bruno, you wanted to add something quickly?
It's only to say it was very interesting, and to me it was very important because to understand that there are experience like that I participate in Brazil, in Greece, in other countries. It's very, very interesting. And I discovered we have many things in common. It's very nice.
I wanted to underline that Bruno presented a work on the Brazil case not from Brazil, but in a specific case, Bruno comes from social work. Is a field of scholarship and is a professor in social work. And from this perspective, he started this mobilization and I found many affinities also in his work. And that's also why I suggested his paper. And I think it was very interesting also this dialogue from someone that doesn't work really on social movements. So it's also interesting because it brings this perspective from this field, and it was particularly for me very inspiring also to see this kind of very different experiences and also similar concerns, analytical concerns.
Social work is about social reproduction.
Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah, so that's great. I hope that we can meet soon somewhere. And in the meantime, very nice end of academic year. Hi, Haris. Nice to see you too. And have a rest nicely during the holiday, I hope. And
you too. You too.
Happy New Year and everything.
Thank you for inviting us. It was really nice.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming. It was very nice.
Nice meeting you all.
Thank you.
Nice meeting you.
Nice to meet you. Ciao, ciao.
Enjoy holidays. Bye.
Ciao.